Welcome back to another Boxscore Geeks show. Unfortunately, he's on the disabled list, but that doesn't stop him from podcasting. We have a special guest this week, Chris Ye. We have just a ton of topics, so I don't have much more of a tease than that, but I'll let Chris introduce himself and say hey, and then we'll just get to it. So, Chris, how's it going?
Hey, guys. It's Chris Ye, best-selling author of books like Blitzscaling and the Alliance, and sadly, along with Kevin Durant and several other people, victim of a ruptured Achilles tendon.
I will say this. You've made the joke that unlike Kevin Durant, you didn't get the big payday first. A spoiler for those that haven't followed the show. You did do it right. You did the Mental Samurai. You did win Mental Samurai first and then get the injury. It wasn't like you got injured and missed your chance at becoming the next Mental Samurai.
That is very true. I've had to sacrifice a couple of things, though. The main thing is I missed my family's planned vacation to Japan. So my wife and kids went to Japan without me because I couldn't fly so soon after surgery. And moreover, Japan's very much a walking intensive country. So I would have been wheeled around in a wheelchair in the rain. Would have been very unpleasant.
Do you mind if I share? I'm going to, and then we can cut it if we need to. But I was going to say one of your most amusing things is you had a Breaking Bad moment where you got in a fight with a fly in a wheelchair, which is something you don't think about when you're not wheelchair bound, but a fly could just ruin your day.
Absolutely. A fly was present in the house. Misty, our dog, was trying to catch it, but of course, she's a dog. She can't get much higher than 24 or 36 inches off the ground. And if I could walk, it would have been easy. I have one of those electric fly swatters, and I could have gone over and killed it easily. But with crutches on, no ability to carry anything, that fly had free rein.
That sounds like a complete nightmare. Like I said, not quite as bad as the Walter White ruining a multi-million-dollar meth operation, but equally bad. I did not introduce our producer, so Brian Foster, our voice of God and man of many hats. You can find him on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Hey, Brian.
Oh, what's going on, guys? It's great to be back on the show with you.
I forget this almost every show, but I'll just do our brief shout out. So sunshower.io/nerd numbers. They are a cloud computation company. They are our sponsor. And I remember like once every 5 shows, but luckily they don't hold it against us. So if cloud computation rings any bells to you, if you want to optimize that, and that's setting off any alarms in your head, sunshower.io/nerd numbers. We have a lot to go over, so we're going to do that. I'm going to actually do something that I've also forgotten most shows, Chris, which is Last Week on Lost, which makes complete sense to do with a guest host. So Last Week on Lost, those where I go over comments, because we actually have a couple. We had Greg Steele on, another great guest. We'll see. He set the bar pretty high, Chris, although you're up at that elite level as well. So
I'm a 5-timer plus, but I must admit I don't have the kind of numbers that Greg had. That was impressive.
I was gonna say you both are up there. I'm thankful that you both like slumming it on this show. But anyway, so someone on that podcast left a comment that said Dre keeps interrupting Greg, and because the narrative of this show, I think the narrative we're gonna have, Chris, you kind of introduced this topic, is I'm gonna use the word narrative again. I apologize, but basically narrative versus reality. How the narrative doesn't always fit with reality. I think that's going to be kind of an underlying theme on this week's show. I wanted to ruin podcasts for people by slightly defending myself and also agreeing. So the criticism Dre interrupts, I'm actually going to say wholeheartedly agree. I do like interrupting. I'll work on it. But on the Greg show, what's interesting is anybody that runs a podcast is familiar with the possibility of lag. Chris, if you haven't followed the Chris Ye podcast, it's great. I think you've been on hiatus, understandably so, Chris, with your injury. But one of the most fantastic backlogs to listen to if you like business. And then how is you and Reid Hoffman's? I don't remember if I added that to my RSS feed. I think I need to update that. But how is the get the name? I always like.
Yes. So Reid Hoffman and I have a new podcast series out. You can find it under the Greylock podcast. So Greylock is the venture capital firm where Reid works. And their podcast is called Grey Matter, Grey Matter. And we have the Blitzscaling series, and Reid and I are going to do about, we estimate, 50 episodes where we dive deep into the details of Blitzscaling and also answer questions that are posed on social media or by people in various organizations.
And yeah, I actually just realized that I have not updated. I use Downcast as a fantastic tool to listen to podcasts. I highly recommend it because you can listen at 2x speed. You can add a bunch. I realized I forgot to add that, Chris. So I've listened to the first episode of U2, which was fantastic. I don't know how many behind am I? How many have you published so far?
I believe we've published 5 or 6. So it's actually a reasonably good number. And again, they're mixed in with Greylock's other podcasts, which are, of course, also good, but do not involve Reed and myself necessarily.
Okay, so I need to catch up on that. And then I was going to say, I think that took a hit to some of the Chris Ye podcast, but also check up on those. And it's a really easy backlog to get through because you do a lot of like 5-10 minute episodes. Back to the original point, one of your first recordings, I know you had the software and it was like slightly out of sync with you and someone on a phone. And that is such an easy thing to happen if you're a podcaster. So latency dealing with someone on a remote, on a phone or whatever. And then Greg and I had lag, so we were slightly off. That's one thing. And so that made it a little harder. Someone's like, you keep interrupting. It's like what you were missing, and I thought we addressed a few times on the show, was we were actually about half a second out of sync. So there would be times where I thought, okay, I've left the pregnant pause. That's what you want to leave in a podcast to let someone speak. I've left the pregnant pause. Greg's going to talk. Greg hasn't talked. I'll keep going, and Greg would hop in at the very end of it. And the last thing to ruin about podcasts for people out there is the really awesome ones. And I'm imagining you and Reed's has done this. Do you guys have an editor?
So we do. So what happens is Reed and I record the podcast in person together. That eliminates the lag problem.
That's amazing.
We each have our own microphone. And then there actually is a professional sound engineer who comes in and cleans things up. And there's also people on Greylock's marketing team help trim out the various verbal ums and uhs and things like that to make us sound better. Although I like to tell people that there's practically zero trimming you have to do when I speak. I've trained myself to avoid speaking those things.
You are an amazing podcaster. That was one of the first things when I started listening to your episodes that you were recording with, like on your phone in the car. I was like, wow, he's still doing this really well. That's the ideal world, is being the single take person. But to ruin the veneer of podcast to people, the podcast you really like, have an editor, have a person that cleans up stuff like that. And I know like real film buffs, and I assume you're one of them, Chris. We hardly ever talk your film love because we always go basketball or business. But like, I know film buffs, you watch a show or a movie and they recognize, oh, the reason they used that cut was because they didn't have coverage, or they're using this angle because the person wasn't on set that day. And if you listen to it in podcast, just wait for like when they add the music or when there are weird topic shifts where it seems like everybody's ignoring something. It's like there was probably an editor and there was a lot of ums, ahs, or a really long tangent that was dropped for that.
And by the way, one of the things that happens is the sound engineers always make sure they get what they call room tone, so they can put in empty space, because just if they put in blank audio, it wouldn't quite sound right. You need to have that continuation of whatever background noises there are, the lights, the buzzing, the air conditioning. Otherwise, it doesn't sound natural.
I was going to ask, Chris, I'm going to throw this out there because you seem to be a master of everything, like the hedgehog or whatever. Or no, what is it? The hedgehog?
The fox.
You're a fox. I was going to say this. Are you a fan of Dimitri Martin?
Oh, I am aware of Dimitri Martin, but I have not spent a lot of time looking at him.
He's a fantastic person to listen to. He's a stand-up comedian. And he actually, one of the kind of obsessive things he did when he started out is he had a special on Comedy Central. And Comedy Central, exactly what we're saying. He was aware of that. They have an editor. So a fun one is, are you a Mitch Hedberg fan? Rest of
Yes.
Okay, Mitch Hedberg. Mitch Hedberg's special for Comedy Central is amazing. The Raw Cut is horrible because the Raw Cut, he just does not connect with the audience. He's starting to get flustered because they're not laughing. At one point, he sits down dejectedly in the middle of the stage. And if you watch the original cut, it's a horrible special. But when you watch the Comedy Central one, they cut together his best jokes so it looks like the audience is on a roll. I'm sure they have B-roll, like you were saying, the room tone, where they have the audience laughing or making noise so it doesn't sound weird. And then they actually cut it together really, really well. So Comedy Central, if there's a special, they would do that. Dimitri Martin didn't want them to cut up his special. So when he did a special for Comedy Central, he played a guitar through a lot of his tones. He brought an easel with where he was showing drawings. And so he would flip the drawings and he knew, well, they can't cut this joke because there's a drawing behind me and it goes in order. So they can't cut around that. So he went out of his way to say, you are not going to cleverly cut up my special Anyway, but we'll get back on track.
Sound guy must have hated that.
And for those of you who are movie fans, just one other shout out. I don't remember the name of the video producer now, but there's a video that a film student produced looking at the church fight scene in Kingsman. That's the one where Colin Firth is in the church full of bigots and the MacGuffin goes off and causes everyone to go into a homicidal rage. And he basically has this fight where he kills like 50 people. And it's done as a one shot. Right, a oneer, where it seems like the camera's on him the whole time. It's done in one continuous take. But this film student actually dissected it and shows you the 30 or 40 different cuts that they sneak in with a whip pan or with a reaction shot or with all these different things so that it feels like a oneer, but it's actually composited out of 40 different cuts.
Absolutely. And so now that you know what to look for, I mean, it would be the lamest podcast in the world, but it would be really easy to do a podcast of, that NPR podcast that you thought was amazing. Here's where they cut. Here's where the person obviously didn't answer the question, but they made it seem like they did. And, to keep us in tangent land, Brian, I'm going to keep us in tangent land. So, Chris, you and I were emailing back and forth, and you have a great story that basically applies to narrative versus reality. I'm going to try and compare that to Hamilton, which has almost nothing to do with it. So I'm going to go on a tangent, find a weak connector, and then hand the mic to you. And so I always have to get into Blitzscale in comparison. It's one of our new favorite things. For those that haven't read the hit book by Chris Ye and Reed Hoffman, What Are You Doing Here? Go check out Blitzscaling. We think every NBA team should read it. But the key premise, and tell me if I'm slaughtering like the thesis, and I've actually changed my thinking on this, Chris, but the key premise is sacrificing efficiency in the name of high upside in business. So a lot of companies, when they're trying to make a new product, they want to make it very public. They want to make it very polished. They want to get the perfect presentation for their investors. They want everything right. And you and Reed go, sometimes getting to market with the most viable product trumps all of that. So you should do that.
Yes, and I think that you can look at it in the NBA, and you can see this offseason is a classic reflection of it. You have teams like the Lakers and the Clippers both making these trades where they give up tremendous amounts of draft equity. And again, we can have that discussion about how valuable draft picks actually are in order to go all in on this coming season or this next couple of seasons, because there is a window that's open. The market is up for grabs. The Warriors are gone, more or less. Sorry, Brian. And as a result, if you have the chance to contend, this is the time to do it. Yeah. And it doesn't make sense to think about, well, 5 years down the line, maybe we'll have some issues. Guess what? How often do you have a chance to go for a championship?
And what we could even argue is even the optimal trade. I've joked about this. On NBA 2K, you can do this, right? You offer a trade, the computer rejects it, you reset the game, you try again, you up it slightly, right? I offered 2 first-round draft picks. This time I'll offer 3. I offered $500,000. This time I'll offer $600,000, whatever. You can't do that in the real world. When people are making fun of the Lakers for mucking up their trade, it's 1 or 2 draft picks, which in the long run, I keep saying no amount of draft picks is going to be worth in the opposite, right? No amount of draft picks is too expensive for Anthony Davis. And so that's blitzscaling. Another premise you bring up, Reed calls this, be embarrassed by your first product. And again, the way I've changed my thinking on blitzscaling, Chris, tell me if you like this. I'm going to see if I can appeal it to basketball. On this show, we like to say a lot that people focus on the wrong statistics and metrics. They're too focused on points per games, Kobe-like players, and not as focused on underrated things like, rebounds or scoring efficiency. So that's that, and like the Lamar Odom, who was such a key component of that second Lakers almost three-peat. Blitzscaling, I think you and Reed say the same thing. I think you say too many startup companies focus on like burn and ROI and do not focus enough on the right metrics. And the right metrics might be things like flexibility or pivots you can do before, your second round of raising. So that's kind of how I've changed my mindset on it, right? Is I actually, if that works for you, Chris, is I'm saying blitzscaling to me is very much an analytics book where you say people are using the wrong numbers.
That's right. People are focused on a set of conventional numbers, and what they're not doing is saying, well, which are the numbers that really matter? And that's what Wins Produced is all about. What are the things that actually matter? And blitzscaling consists of looking at what has actually contributed to the companies that are the most valuable startup companies, and how did they get there?
And yeah, and people look at the wrong metrics. So like, oh, how much money did you raise or whatever? And you and Reed say stuff like, well, the company, obviously he brings up PayPal a lot in there. Another famous one is YouTube. These two companies, right? What they started with was not anywhere close to what they finished at. They pivoted a lot, and that pivoting was important. And as I said, Reed says, be embarrassed of your first product. I'm going to apply that to Hamilton by Lin-Manuel Miranda, which is this hit musical that took the world by storm a few years ago. The origin story of that is his first presentation of it was in front of Michelle and Barack Obama. And to everybody, myself included, that sounds like the gutsiest thing in the world. He's like, I had this idea for a rap concept album at the time. It turned into a musical about Alexander Hamilton, and I hadn't shown it to anybody else. And the first time I tried it in front of Michelle and Barack Obama. And everybody's like, oh my God, you're workshopping this? And that sounds like such a ludicrous idea at the time. Infamously, Jon Stewart made fun of him, but he did it. And when he talks about it in interviews, he says, here's the thing. It's a lot of work to put together an album. So if I was going to put all the work into this, if it doesn't succeed in that room, in a slam poetry session in front of the president of the United States, if it falls flat there, I know I can just cut my losses and run. And that really is the key point. Okay, so that kind of relates to blitzscaling. The last part, which before I'll do to try and tie it to your Uncle Dennis story, Chris, is in Hamilton the musical, Thomas Jefferson, has rap battles with Alexander Hamilton. He's amazingly spoken, amazingly suave, right? Originally played by Daveed Diggs. In reality, Thomas Jefferson was a horrible public speaker. He only gave 2 speeches in office. One was horribly received. When we think of Thomas Jefferson, everything about Thomas Jefferson is his writing, not his speaking. He was not a good speaker. But Hamilton, as a narrative, to make that character as a musical, has to tie Thomas Jefferson to the narrative of being a suave, good speaker that's able to debate well, even though that's not reality. So Hamilton has to force a narrative onto a person that doesn't really apply. You had a great comparable in the NBA recently, which is Uncle Dennis with Kawhi Leonard, and how the media is forcing a narrative on him because they have the story we all know. The what's the ball? What the ball dad? Not Lonzo. Lamar ball.
LeVar Ball.
They want Uncle Dennis to be a LeVar Ball. We're used to that story. The overbearing parent that gets in the way, and that's not really the case. And you told me this, and I didn't know, but it's amazing. So we'll let you tell us about Kawhi.
Absolutely. And before we move on from Lin-Manuel Miranda, let's just emphasize he wasn't just some random guy in the White House who was on tour. He's like, let me do my rock musical in front of Barack Obama. He was already a Tony Award-winning playwright who had created a Tony Award-winning musical called In the Heights, which incidentally, I just learned from looking at Wikipedia, occurred because he created the show when he was a sophomore at Wesleyan. They staged it. And a number of famous Wesleyan people, like Wesleyan alum Neil Patrick Stewart, came up to him and said, you should make this into a Broadway show. We want to help you do it.
Wow. And I mean, but that also applies to your point where it is going, if you are someone talented or you're an NBA franchise and you don't want to waste your time, figure it out quick. And that was the case. And also, while he was doing Hamilton, he was working on Moana. So this guy is amazing and has the absolute right mentality of, if I'm going to invest my efforts in something, I should make sure it's worth it.
You can definitely bet on him getting the EGOT at some point, the Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, Tony combination.
Does he not have it's Oscar yet on my?
No, I think he's probably got an Oscar. I think he still needs to get an Emmy.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So all he has to do is get himself one of these online special guest appearances on television, he may be heading in. He
was on Brooklyn Nine-Nine this last season, and it was great, although I don't know if he'll get an Emmy for that, but it would be funny if he did.
I did actually see that. I've watched some amount of Brooklyn Nine-Nine on the plane, and I saw the episode where I think he is he's the yes, that's right. He's Santiago's brother who's better than her at everything.
And yeah, it was a great, if you haven't seen that episode, it's great. I especially like how Brooklyn Nine-Nine took on that episode because shouldn't be a surprise to most people. Brooklyn Nine-Nine is one of these shows that is really smart and clever. It doesn't go the traditional sitcom route that you would expect with that storyline.
Yeah. So anyways, let's talk about the narrative that you referred to. So Uncle Dennis is the uncle of Kawhi Leonard. And this whole time, the media has portrayed Uncle Dennis as this overbearing parental figure, this shadowy Svengali. Hey, here we have Kawhi Leonard. He's the perfect soldier. He doesn't like to talk a lot. He's very soft-spoken. And this is all occurring because Uncle Dennis, evil Uncle Dennis, is pushing this. And that's the narrative that they're trying to go with. They're trying to drive a wedge between Kawhi and Uncle Dennis, and they're trying to disparage Uncle Dennis. And the thing is, what I pointed out is I said, all these stories about Uncle Dennis, they almost never say his last name, and they never say anything about him. If anything, they may occasionally mention he was a successful businessman. And that's it. So I said, well, let me look up what Uncle Dennis did. So I had to do a bunch of searching, and I finally found an article which told me his last name, which is Robertson. So his name is Dennis Robertson. And the way he came into Kawhi's life is that he is, of course, Kawhi's uncle. And tragically, when Kawhi was a teenager, Kawhi's father, who owned a car wash, was killed in a robbery at that car wash. And so Uncle Dennis became his primary father figure and sort of the man in his life. And he was there helping Kawhi all along as he was a basketball player and then deciding on college and going to San Diego State and ultimately ending up in the NBA. For most of this time, Uncle Dennis was a successful banking executive. So he's a banker at Chase and then later moved over to another bank called Carver Federal Savings Bank, which is, interestingly enough, the country's largest publicly traded African-American owned bank. It was set up in New York City to serve African Americans who were being denied banking services for racism purposes. And so Uncle Dennis is a very successful businessman who's worked for one of the world's largest banks and worked for this bank which serves this incredible social cause, and you never hear about any of this. All you hear about is Uncle Dennis is this bad influence on Kawhi.
And yeah, I mean, and like I said, I'm going to tie this back to a piece that we wrote about your Lakers recently, Chris, which is the David and Goliath piece, which is the Lakers are always portrayed as the Yankees. The Yankees in Moneyball is what the Lakers are portrayed as. This overbearing team that can outspend everybody, that everybody wants to go to, and they have this unfair advantage of the NBA. And similar to what you're saying, I just went through recent history and said the NBA itself came through to cancel the Chris Paul thing. Go Doc. Not mine. Yeah.
That's Misty barking. I warned you it might happen. Keep going.
I was going to say, your dog is well trained because I noticed Lakers fan, I bring up the Chris Paul trade.
Oh, yeah. She gets upset right away.
Okay. So the Chris Paul trade was canceled, if for those that don't recall. Back in the day, the Lakers thought they were going to pick up Chris Paul when he was on the free market. Because the NBA had possession of the Pelicans or Hornets or whatever they were called at the time, and a bunch of owners complained. They said, this is not fair that they're getting Chris Paul. They canceled the trade. And then don't forget that when Kawhi wanted to go to the Lakers last season, and the Spurs were like, that is not happening. To the point that Greg Popovich got on the phone to the Pelicans to say, don't you dare trade them Anthony Davis. Don't forget, Anthony Davis was also on the block. Everybody thought it was a foregone conclusion that trade deadline, he was going to the Lakers. And the Pelicans held firm. And as recently as the beginning of this offseason, everybody was saying, there is no way Anthony Davis is going to the Lakers before he finally did. So this media, this belief, this narrative about the Lakers is they have this unfair advantage. And I said, not really. And some other teams are catching up, right? The Brooklyn Nets are now in Brooklyn and run by a billionaire owner who's not afraid to spend money around. He's still learning, right? Don't forget, he wasted it on Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce back in the day. That happened. Steve Ballmer got a hold of the Clippers. So the Clippers, who used to be terrible because of Sterling.
Yes, horrible.
Force. So this belief that the Lakers are the only big market team with a fancy front office that's willing to spend money isn't true, but people love pinning that narrative to the Lakers, even though it's not true. And Uncle Dennis, as you're saying, people are stealing the LeVar Ball narrative, the overbearing family member that's sticking their nose in where it doesn't belong. And what you're saying is that is absolutely not true. And I do enjoy that because that's what we do a lot in sports. Brian, we bring up wrestling all the time, right? And note that people try and add a narrative to sports when it's not there. And sometimes people get upset when you tear away the narrative to say Kawhi Leonard was absolutely right to do what he did. He got to the best team that he wanted to in the circumstances he wanted to. And we were talking pre-show, Chris, you brought this up. Basically, ask yourself who was upset with those narratives as to why it's not getting reported differently.
Absolutely. It's amazing to me. And again, here in the NBA, there are the governors. We're not allowed to call them owners anymore. We call them governors. But there are the governors of the various teams who are all billionaires because these teams are all worth over $1 billion. And somehow they managed to manipulate the media so that we blame the players instead of the governors for these various things. It's astonishing. It's like we're going to hate on the millionaires and sympathize with the billionaires.
Yep.
It was funny. I forgot to add this to the script, Brian. Sorry to keep throwing dirt on your Warriors, because the grave's very newly minted.
Yeah, it needs more dirt.
Yeah.
Sorry, Brian.
But so I don't know if you recall, Steve Kerr came out recently and said he was just unhappy with how Anthony Davis handled the trade and saying, well, it's really on Anthony Davis to fulfill his bargain with the contract. And what I'll note what you're saying, Chris, on the governors. And it was funny. I tweeted about that because I was like, yeah, getting rid of the term owner doesn't really do a lot if you don't change the dynamic. Is what it is. But Anthony Davis is in New Orleans because they tanked to get him. He had a restricted free agency, so this is the first chance he's had a chance to move. And so this idea of going, it's so unfair that Anthony Davis is not living up to his contract when he did. He played out his contract as he was supposed to. He had no say and no decision. So the fact that you're saying, oh, this poor billionaire owner who was gifted the most talented player that really, let's be honest, Anthony Davis, if the Lakers were allowed, they would have given him a max, $100 million 4-year contract right out of college. He would have gone there and it would have been better for the NBA. It is horrible that Zion Williamson is going to the Pelicans right now instead of being on a good team.
Yeah, the whole point of the NBA draft and the system is set up so that the governors, again, I'm going to say governors, or the franchises, can control the players' rights for 7 years. And just imagine if when you left college, Dre, you were told you don't get to pick your employer is picked for you, and you don't have a choice. You have to work for them for at least 7 years, no matter what.
And if, because that's the other funny thing is, in theory, because I phrase this as well, Anthony Davis basically said, look, I'm not coming back. You have time to trade me. And unfortunately, I'll say this is the NBA's fault. The Pelicans were right to give up the season the way they did because the NBA recently changed the draft incentive. So that's kind of on the NBA.
They got rewarded with Zion.
Yeah. But the point being, Anthony Davis basically said, hey, I'm leaving. I'm giving you my 2 weeks, and I'm giving you an opportunity to maximize my trade value. And then the media spun it as Anthony Davis is being his diva, trying to force his way off the team. Whereas when Zion Williamson was drafted by New Orleans, the same media isn't coming out and going, look at how unfair it is that New Orleans is forcing a talented player onto their squad when that player could easily win a title or help win a title for a team like the Lakers.
And the thing is, so the other thing I will say is this. I think that there is some fairness to the notion of Lakers exceptionalism and advantage, but it's something that has largely disappeared. And here's what I mean. In an earlier era, the owners of NBA teams were people like the Buss family, where the NBA team was their primary asset. And so the Lakers, in the old days, had the advantage of glamour, the media market, the endorsements, the fact that you get to live in Los Angeles, which is probably the most common off-season home of all NBA players in general. So it's the easiest way for them to play at home, so to speak. But the Lakers had this advantage because all the other teams had basically the same ownership structure, some family or person for whom it was their primary asset. Now, if we look at teams like the Clippers or the Nets, the team is not the primary asset. The Clippers are owned by Steve Ballmer, who is the richest owner in the NBA, can spend an unlimited amount of money on the things that are outside the salary cap, such as buying the best front office money can buy and having the best facilities. And ultimately, it sounds like building an arena so that the Clippers have their own arena as well. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, Brooklyn, the Nets, have Prokhorov as their owner, but he's only their owner in name only at this point because he sold 49% of the team to the co-founder of Alibaba, who's worth $9 billion. And so these teams have enormously successful executives who have run multi-$100 billion companies and who are bringing that experience to bear in a way that the traditional family-owned NBA team just couldn't. So I think that we're going to see more advances among teams like the Clippers and the Nets because ownership or governorship, if you will, is becoming one of the competitive advantages, and the Buss family no longer has that competitive advantage.
And of course, it really, really hurt the Lakers that there was strife. I mean, it's very Game of Thrones. It doesn't matter if we think that Jim Buss, right? That was the son?
Yes, Jimmy Buss.
Jimmy Buss. It doesn't matter if we think he was a good or a bad owner. He was a horrible owner for what it's worth. I mean, they lit. I mean, what, you're still paying off the Luol Deng contract that he just lit on fire as soon as free agency opened. When Kevin Durant was on the market, oh, sorry. So for those that have forgotten, they gave, like, as soon as like the doors opened, this was like a Black Friday sale with some of the best names in the NBA. The doors opened. Every team's got a spike in salary cap. The Lakers have a bunch of money to spend too, finally. And they, day one, signed Timofey Mozgov and Luol Deng for, what was it, a combined $40 million, somewhere around there?
So the starting salaries were $18 million a year for Deng and $16 million a year for Mozgov, for $34 million a year.
And then it obviously...
And then increasing after that. And by the way, as you can tell, everyone knows $34 million is a max contract now. Several years ago, it was a max contract and a half.
Yes.
And it was two players that everybody at the time, like, we praised the Cavaliers at the time for picking up Mozgov with some picks, because we went, same point we're making about Anthony Davis. Those picks aren't doing anything for him right now, and they have LeBron James. So if you turn it into a viable center, and notice I use the word viable, that is a great move. When the offseason came along and the Lakers offered him $16 million, it was like, and the Lakers let him go. Not the Lakers. When the Lakers offered him $16 million and the Cavs let him go. There we go. We were like, you played that hand of poker perfectly. You value bet the flop. You missed on the turn. The Lakers went all in on the river, and you folded. We couldn't have said you played it any better. So they did great.
And when it comes to Mozgov and Deng, I don't blame those guys for taking the money. I mean, heck, if somebody offered me $16 million a year or $18 million a year, I'm not going to say, oh, gosh, I don't think I'm worth that. I'm going to take that money and put it in the bank. And so it's the fault of the general manager. And in this case, although Mitch Kupchak was the general manager, he was being forced to do these things by Jimmy Buss, who had made this promise that if the Lakers didn't contend, he would give up his position running the Lakers. And Jeannie Buss held him to it.
And future first-round Hall of Famer Dwayne Wade, to your point, Chris, when people said, "Why are you playing for the Chicago Bulls still?" he said, "I can think of 25 million reasons why." He was getting paid. Back to the original point where you're saying the competitive advantages as front offices, the Lakers were divided for 4 or 5 years. And so it is. I'm curious your thoughts, because Jeannie Buss has come under a lot of flack recently. I don't know what the state is. Obviously, the Magic Johnson, and who's the
Rob Pelinka.
All of that's going on. I'm curious if you have your opinions there, because it does seem interesting to me that those three essentially insured a very fractured franchise. That even getting LeBron, like I said, Luol Deng's contract is still on the books, being phased out. I'm curious as to your thoughts on the criticisms of this last year and a half, given how far behind they started, I would argue.
So I would say that historically, Jeannie Buss has had a very good reputation in the NBA and with the fans in general. I think that people were very happy among Laker fans when Jimmy Buss was ousted, when she ousted her brother and took full control over the Lakers. We definitely view this as a positive sign. I would say that the biggest mistake she made, which is an understandable one, but nonetheless clearly was a mistake, was putting Magic Johnson in charge. And Magic Johnson, bless his heart, I think arguably the greatest player of all time, the god of wins produced. Just go back and look over his page on Boxscore Geeks sometimes if you ever doubt it. Incredible. One of the greatest players, one of the smartest basketball players of all time, not a great, and a brilliant business person, not a great NBA executive. And it boils down to he was not good at evaluating talent. For example, the report is that when the Lakers selected Mo Wagner in the first round, he was overruling the Lakers scouting staff, the same scouting staff that found gems like Larry Nance and Josh Hart. A lot of people say Kyle Kuzma. We'll talk about Kuzma later on, but find these great picks in the later rounds. And where they wanted to go with that pick, which was the number 25 pick, is they wanted Mitchell Robinson.
Oh, really?
And Magic overruled them to take Mo Wagner.
That's so brutal.
Ow.
Imagine the Lakers with Mitchell Robinson as well.
I got to tell you guys something real fast. The most ridiculous thing ever is that Mitchell Robinson played in the Summer League. Look at his numbers. Like, he dominated real NBA players last year. Him in the Summer League was insane this year.
And unnecessary for that.
Unnecessary. He could have gotten hurt, right?
Exactly. So when I say Magic Johnson was a bad executive, that's an example. The other example of Magic Johnson being a bad executive is that Magic Johnson leaks more than a rowboat that's had holes punched in it. And I think that came about, you saw it in the Kawhi Leonard pursuit. Magic couldn't help but leak that Kawhi Leonard had requested a meeting with him. And Kawhi had specifically told the teams, this is a test. You guys have to remain silent.
So, by the way, do you know one of the most famous stories that relates to the Lakers in a roundabout way is, if anybody out there has read Terry Pluto's Loose Balls, which is about the history of the ABA. Back in the day, the American Basketball Association, which was a competitor with the NBA, they were trying to get Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, then Lou Alcindor, to sign with them. And so what their scouts said is, we're going to put $1 million check in a briefcase. We're going to slap open the briefcase. We're going to slide the check in front of him, and we're going to say he can play wherever he wants. And that was their plan. And they said, we've also gotten the knowledge, the foreknowledge that he's a very personality-driven person, as you know, Chris, from seeing him on the Lakers. He's not going to give us a chance to negotiate. So if we fail here and he goes to the NBA, it's over. He's not coming back. And so then last second, they overruled whoever had said to do that. They decided to hardball him instead of negotiating with him and give him that money. And so then, of course, he goes to the NBA, gets drafted, goes to the Bucks, gets unhappy with the Bucks. So many issues here with Milwaukee, and winds up on the Lakers. So very similar thing where you've got an executive who has a very personality-driven athlete, and it's like, just do this. Don't do this with him. And last second changes it. So
I would say that if you look at what's happened with Rob Pelinka, independent of Magic Johnson, I would say that as a whole, he seems to make good decisions, and he really understands how to manipulate the salary cap. So the way he handled Luol Deng, not his mess, he had to clean up someone else's mess. He waited until there was only 1 year left on Luol Deng's contract. So basically, he waited until the start of last season. The Lakers were on the hook for his full salary for that season, and then they cut him and stretched him. So basically, they only stretched 1 year of his salary across those 3 years. So it minimized the salary cap impact, whereas a lot of other people had said, no, they have to stretch him before the season because they don't know what sort of opportunities are going to arise for them to use that salary cap space. Pelinka knew, all I have to do is wait until the day his salary becomes guaranteed and then cut him the day after that. Or if you look at when people said the Lakers can't possibly open up full max salary slots for Kawhi Leonard, he said, no, all we have to do is trade all the remaining players we have, which they were able to do.
Can I see if I get the right read on the situation of events? Because we've been talking a lot about narrative versus reality, and I think people kind of miss. So I think, does this timeline of events read right for the Lakers? The Lakers acquire LeBron James, great move. The Lakers are expecting another star, either one of Paul George or Kawhi Leonard. They think they're getting Kawhi Leonard. To your point, Magic Johnson is a huge leaker. So I think Paul George, my take at the time was that Paul George read the writing on the wall and said, you know what, I'm just going to get my money. And in fact, Paul George played that perfectly because he's like, I can get my money, and if things aren't working out here, I can force my way off. And, God bless the Clippers for taking advantage of the Lakers' advantage that the Lakers don't have anymore, as I mentioned, because can you imagine what would have happened if Paul George had demanded a trade to the Lakers? They would have given just as good of a deal as the Clippers wound up. Nobody seems to care that happened with the Clippers. That was, in my opinion, like the Clippers fleeced the Thunder so badly for Paul George, and no one's blinking an eye, whereas everybody's talking about how the Lakers, how unfair it is that they got Anthony Davis despite giving up everything for him. So,
yeah, no, again, it's astonishing. Again, people say, oh, my God, I can't believe the Lakers gave up so much for Anthony Davis. They're like, oh, wow, the Clippers, what a brilliant deal to get Paul George. And I'm like, it's because there are so many people around the NBA who despise the Lakers, and especially fans around the NBA who despise Lakers fans, with some justification.
But so turn of events, Lakers think they're going to get a second star, Paul George or Kawhi. Magic tilts that they're going Kawhi, so Paul George opts in. So they missed. Oh,
well, so the Lakers were expecting Paul George to come to the Lakers last offseason instead of staying with Oklahoma City. Then they would have had the LeBron James Paul George combo and done the trade for Anthony Davis. They would have the 3 stars with LeBron, Paul George, and Anthony Davis. That was their plan.
Do you have any insight into why? Because like I said, my reading, and I could have been wrong, was that I thought Paul George thought they were going to get Kawhi. and balked as a result. Do you have any insight into why he didn't end up going to them?
Yeah, so basically the Lakers were in a feud with his agent, Aaron Mintz.
God.
So Aaron Mintz, who is Paul George's agent, was also the agent for Julius Randle and D'Angelo Russell. And he notoriously had a bad relationship with the Lakers after the D'Angelo Russell and Julius Randle era. And so he made sure that the Lakers didn't get a meeting with Paul George. The other conspiracy theory, which Bill Simmons traffics in, is that the NBA told the Lakers, you tampered too much, you just can't have Paul George.
And that was Magic Johnson point. He got fined $500,000 for going. So they might have said, if we're going like the Michael Jordan was asked to retire conspiracy because he was betting too hard, we're going with a similar conspiracy theory that the NBA said the optics are just too bad if you get Paul George at this point, so you snooze, you lose. So that happened. Then Kawhi, the Spurs basically were like, we are not going to give him to you, and held pretty firm on that. And then they missed out on that. LeBron James got injured. They thought they were going to get Anthony Davis. The Pelicans were like, we are not going to give you Anthony Davis. And that leads us into last offseason.
Yeah. And I think that the Lakers were right to try to get Kawhi Leonard. If you get a chance to get Kawhi Leonard, you absolutely have to try to do it. But in the end, I think they ended up in a good place. And, a lot of people haven't really looked carefully at the numbers around the team that the Lakers had assembled. So let's go through that team a little bit. And let me lay out a starting five for you. So starting at center, JaVale McGee. At power forward, Anthony Davis. At small forward, LeBron James. At shooting guard, Danny Green. And at point guard, let's say Rajon Rondo. Now, if you were to add up the wins produced that those players produced in 2018, 2019, what number do you think you'd roughly get?
So LeBron James is low. That's the rough.
Including all the injuries, LeBron James's injury, and the shutdown of Anthony Davis by the Pelicans.
I'll guess randomly 65 to start it out, Chris.
That's got to be too
high. That's high, but you're actually not that far off.
So what is it? I said 45-50. Brian went 60. The answer is?
So Anthony Davis is 14. LeBron and JaVale are both about 10. So that's 34 right there. Danny Green is another 10, 44. And Rajon Rondo, despite all the injuries, was about 5. So about 49. Just from the starting lineup, without getting into the fact that they also have above-average players at many of those other positions. So they have Boogie Cousins, above-average player last year. They have Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, much maligned, but above-average player. Alex Caruso, above-average player. So they are probably going to be and again, that's with LeBron James being injured, Anthony Davis being shut down, Rajon Rondo being injured. So unless there's massive injury problems, they are probably a 50 to 55 win team without a problem.
And I know one other player to talk about briefly. I know he was noticeably absent in your rundown is Kyle Kuzma. But what I was going to say, so last year, the unfortunate thing this is a Brian point, so I want to give you full credit for it, Brian. You noted that for all the flack GM LeBron got for Rajon Rondo and JaVale McGee and KCP and Lance Stevenson, that was a good collection of players, and they did well. Last year, what really sunk the Lakers was, I would argue, injury to Josh Hart. He's the least important, but Josh Hart, Rajon Rondo, and LeBron James. And then Brandon Ingram and Kyle Kuzma were terrible.
And let's be clear. Kyle Kuzma was terrible. Brandon Ingram was merely below average.
Okay, that's that. But I mean, what was interesting to me, and I'm trying to look this up actually, is I would argue Brandon Ingram and Kyle Kuzma had too much responsibility for their age. You basically, they're fine replacement level players to go into the Greg Steele, because Greg Steele kind of does an offensive breakdown where he views it like a batting order. Those two players were definitely too high in the batting order for that team.
Yeah. And so what I would say about Kuzma is this. I'm not super optimistic. I think we've talked before on a previous podcast why I think the Lakers kept Kuzma. And a big part of it is that Kuzma played the political game incredibly well. Of the young guys, he was the one that got in the best with LeBron. And he's also the one who ingratiated himself the most with ownership in the front office.
I agree with that. I'm trying to look something up in the background subtly at the moment.
Oh, Dre, I've got a point to get in. So, I mean, depth charts this time of year don't mean a whole lot, but I brought up the ESPN depth chart for the Lakers just to compare to what Chris was saying. I don't know if this is based on anything real or not, but so first of all, they have Cousins instead of McGee starting at center, and that makes some sense, right? We don't agree with it at all, but based on NBA, cachet, Cousins is probably a little bit higher. Of course, they have Kuzma starting at small forward, but then they have LeBron as the point guard. Is that a real rumor, Chris?
That is a real rumor. Coach Frank Vogel has said that the Lakers will use LeBron at point guard. Now, what does that actually mean? What it actually means is that the Lakers may roll out a lineup where they don't have a true point guard, because LeBron runs the offense anyways. Yeah. And so instead of a point guard, they may have, say, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope or Avery Bradley, preferably Pope.
So we'll probably just have Danny Green guard the point guard. LeBron's not going to play point guard on defense, I'm assuming.
No. The lineup. It's so when the Lakers were the Showtime Lakers in the 1980s, their defense was completely different than their offense. So on defense in the 80s, what would happen is Byron Scott would guard the point guard, James Worthy would guard the shooting guard, Magic Johnson would guard the small forward or power forward, and then AC Green would guard the power forward or center, whichever was a tougher cover, and then Kareem would guard whoever was left.
And famously, Magic played and guarded centers in a brief period of time, right? That was part of his legend.
That's right. And if you watch, for example, the Lakers against the Bulls in the NBA Finals, you'll notice that the person covering Michael Jordan, at least at the start, is James Worthy. And then James Worthy got injured. And at that point, they were throwing out guys like Tony Scott to cover him.
But anyway, back to Kuzma. I was going to say, what's interesting about your lack of optimism is I kind of put Kuzma in a Carmelo Anthony spot where I think he showed some upside. He showed a high ceiling, and the Lakers got too high on him and basically gave him too big of a role. And I am curious, especially now that you have LeBron James, Cousins, and Anthony Davis, if Kuzma is going to rightfully get pushed down a little. And then, I mean, barring Andrew Wiggins, most players improve. So obviously Kuzma had a step back last year, but we even just via normal age curve, we expect him to go up. And I would say both in the fact that he's going to be less of the focus on the offense in theory, and that he's going to be a year older. I'm not expecting amazing things out of him, but if he just turns into a replacement level player, that could be huge for the Lakers.
Yeah. And so let me give you the positive case for Kuzma. So Kyle Kuzma does actually have a lot of things going for him. The first thing is that he actually is a very skilled scorer in a number of ways that are important for this team. He's a great cutter. He has an incredible floater game. He is, I think, 95th percentile in his ability to hit those floaters in the lane, which is why he's so aesthetically pleasing a player when you watch him play. And if you look at his numbers for last year, he actually shot 55% on 2-point shots. What dragged down his field goal percentage is he shot 30% on 3-point shots. He took 9 a game.
That's something.
He did shoot they're almost 37 his rookie year, though, so there's some hope.
Correct. So there's hope. There's hope that he has the ability to shoot. His free throwing actually improved from his rookie year to his sophomore year. Basically, almost all the numbers improved from his rookie year to his sophomore year, with the exception of his 3-point shooting and his rebounding figures. And the interesting thing is, I would argue, I think the Lakers actually tend to play Kuzma more as a wing than they do as a power forward. Watch who he guards on defense. He's usually guarding the wings. When the Lakers played the traditionally full-strength Warriors, which is the way we have to refer to them now because God knows we're not sure what we're going to see next year. But when they play the traditionally full-strength Warriors, Kuzma was the one who was typically covering Klay Thompson.
And I mean, that's what I'd prefer. I mean, the wins produce part of why he looks so god-awful last season and even the season before is we're counting him as a power forward. I was looking at Greg Steele's number to see if there's any hope. Greg doesn't care much for him either, Chris. But to both our points, in Greg's numbers, he's going to go down in his order on the rotation. Obviously, Anthony Davis on both offense and defense is, if this is baseball, he's taken that 4th, 5th spot. So you're losing a spot in the order. Yeah. And then we're going to be the same. He's probably going to be a small forward next season. So just age curve and dropping down a position, I see that's a positive.
I view that as a positive for him as well. And again, the key is the shot selection. So this past season, Kuzma had to be a primary scorer, and he had to try to create shots off the dribble. He doesn't have a particularly great handle. He has a good handle for a 6'9" big man, but he doesn't have a handle like a Kawhi Leonard handle. And so where he would struggle is creating shots on his own off the dribble. Where he excelled is attacking closeouts as a secondary attacker or attacking in transition. Where, if you can remember from his rookie season and from the summer league, all his games with Lonzo, you could tell this is a guy who's great at leaking out, getting to the rim, and finishing. So if his shot selection changes dramatically, and where this coming season he's primarily cutting to the basket and shooting at the basket, or alternately taking wide open threes, and where the Lakers ought to be a much better rebounding team thanks to beefing up with Anthony Davis and Boogie Cousins and a full-strength LeBron and JaVale McGee, then the mix of the shots that he takes may improve to the point where he actually becomes a positive contributor.
The last thing I want to say about the Lakers, this is going to be very similar to a piece I wrote about the Warriors last season, Chris, is on paper this team is very strong. But the elephant in the room is just age and health. You've got Rajon Rondo, JaVale McGee, LeBron James, who all dealt with injury last season. Anthony Davis, this is another narrative case, by the way. Anthony Davis is kind of known as injury prone. He has actually been a workhorse the last few seasons. And last season, let's just clear this out, people. Again, breaking your narrative. For anybody who thought like Anthony Davis was sitting for injury last season, essentially the Pelicans knew he was leaving, wanted to shut him down because, one, they don't want to lose his trade value, because if Anthony Davis had pulled a Kevin Durant and hurt himself, it might be all over for them getting that huge package they got with the Lakers. So they wanted to shut him down. So they were starting to say, oh, we're resting him for health reasons. It wasn't health reasons. It was for tanking reasons. They were tanking and keeping Anthony Davis healthy. And eventually the league stepped up and said no. And the compromise they came up with, very similar to the Lakers, by the way, with LeBron James, is we'll play him. We just won't play him the full game.
Dre, I've got some data here to back up your point. Last season was the first season since his rookie year that he's played under 2,000 minutes. He played over 2,700 minutes the 2 seasons before that, and 21, 24, and 23 in the 3 seasons before that. So he has been a workhorse, no question.
So, yeah, I mean, the real question with the Lakers is how healthy can they be? And, the funny thing is, I would argue, Chris, going forward for the Lakers, the point we should look at with the narrative around the Lakers being this well-run organization with this unfair advantage is the Jimmy Buss era should legitimately have tanked the Lakers for a decade. You ended up with so many bad contracts, so many bad draft picks. The only of the stockpile of young assets, right? The only one that was worth a damn was Lonzo Ball.
That's right.
Who you turned into Anthony Davis. You could do worse.
And I'm going to love watching him play on that Pelicans team. I'm still a huge Lonzo fan. His skills, again, while he lacks certain basic skills, which it's maddening to watch, his basketball IQ is incredible.
So I was definitely saying that was the only one. The Lakers with Anthony Davis going forward, that's enough, right? Like we saw LeBron James in Cleveland with a poorly run front office. Anthony Davis means the Lakers are relevant as long as he sticks around for a while.
And you know what the Lakers are doing.
What are they doing?
Here's the deal. The Lakers have Anthony Davis. The Lakers have LeBron James. And all the players they signed in this offseason, they signed to either 1-year contracts or 2-year contracts. They're timing everything for 2021 so that they will have maximum salary cap space, perhaps double max salary cap space, depending on how things go. And you know what they just did? They just picked up off of waivers Kostas Antetokounmpo.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
I love having you on the show for like the hot gossip, Chris, for behind the scenes stuff, because I don't know the agent stuff as well. Because I know the Milwaukee Bucks just did something similar where it's I'm going to mess it up. Thanasis. They picked like this weird. Everybody's trying to court Giannis. What I will say about the Bucks, and I've lamented this. This is the difference between the Bucks and the Lakers. The Bucks just won 60 games, most in the NBA. We're this close to an NBA Finals, right? They are as a Lakers fan, Chris, you have to give them some love. They are one injured game of Giannis away from making the finals. He was injured in Game 5.
Yep.
He injured at the very end of Game 5, which they lost in overtime or close to overtime, and then just was horrible in Game 6. So that's the series.
Yeah.
Which you can appreciate with losing players like James Worthy in the finals, et cetera, et cetera. And then who was it? The Karl Malone year that they missed out.
Karl Malone went down, and that was just disastrous as well because they were playing Slava Medvedenko and Luke Walton at power forward against Rasheed Wallace and Ben Wallace.
Oh dear God. Okay, so you can understand. So they're in a great spot, right? 60-win team, MVP, right? Almost unanimous, right? It was him and James Harden for all the number 1, number 2 votes. What happens this offseason? They let Tony Snell, who we think is overrated and overpaid, but he's a fine player. They essentially waived him because they traded him for John Lure and then waived John Lure. Then, additionally, they had a couple players, Malcolm Brogdon and Chris Middleton, up for renegotiation. They signed one, Chris Middleton, let Malcolm Brogdon go. The Pacers, by the way, are looking great. So they did that. If they were the Lakers just give everybody their money and go, let's try again.
Yeah.
The Milwaukee Bucks are like, let's cut corners. Interesting thing. I'm going to have to look into this a little more, but it appears their former director of analytics, Seth Partnow, today announced that he's going to be answering questions and writing for The Athletic. And I don't know for sure if he's still with the Bucks. So the Bucks are this small market team, great analytics squad in theory, a bunch of great players. And this offseason comes and they cut corners, whereas the Lakers wouldn't have done that. And so if the Bucks think we signed your brother, so you're going to sign with us when your contract is up, the Lakers are like, we did it too, and guess what? We're not going to waive. We're not going to let the third best player, second best. We'd argue second best. They'd probably say third or fourth best player in Malcolm Brogdon. We're going to let that player walk out the door if you're with us.
The other gossipy thing about the Lakers is the Lakers famously in this offseason also signed as their lead assistant coach, Jason Kidd. What do we know about Jason Kidd? Giannis loves Jason Kidd. Giannis was very upset when Jason Kidd was fired. He said Jason Kidd was key to his success, even though, as we know, Jason Kidd's a horrible coach. The Lakers hired Jason Kidd saying, oh, yeah, he's going to mentor Lonzo Ball. Lonzo's been traded, but Jason Kidd's still there as lead assistant. Why? Giannis.
And for what it's worth, by the way, when we talk analytics in sports, this is where I always sell a short, Chris, is I'm like, you could go to any number of sites, print out a list of numbers, and just throw a dart at a board of any of them that you think are reasonable. The people you want in front offices, and where I see so many front offices fail, is the people that are good at wheeling and dealing. So that I'm hoping Giannis ends up on the Lakers. I'm not going to lie.
I think it could very well happen. I think the Lakers in 2021 will start off with Anthony Davis, Giannis Antetokounmpo. Hopefully LeBron coming back for less money so that they can also sign his son LeBron
That's
Jr.
Right.
Bronny. And meanwhile, the Lakers will have reloaded with whomever they can. And as you've noticed, this offseason, the signings basically all made sense. The only one that I don't think made as much sense was signing Avery Bradley. But even then, you could argue, well, he's been injured. He may be better. Maybe the defensive metrics are interesting or something like that. Or maybe LeBron just wanted him. Who knows, from having gone against him so many times. But most of their signings were good signings, right? They signed Danny Green. Great signing. They signed DeMarcus Cousins. Great signing. They got good locker room guys like Jared Dudley who aren't going to play that much. They're just going to be there as a backup small forward for those few minutes that they need it. And they signed Quinn Cook, who can shoot. And they got Avery Bradley, who, again, I'm not a big fan of it, but if that's the worst signing they make this summer, could be a lot worse.
Absolutely. And I've called you're basically calling Kyle Kuzma this, and Avery Bradley might be the same. I've called them Ray Allen signings. So for those that don't remember, back in the day, the Boston Celtics tried really hard to get Kevin Garnett, and our numbers at the time would have said Kevin Garnett just joining that Celtics squad. If you believe Paul Pierce is coming back, hey, guess what? Rajon Rondo was a really promising young player. Paul Pierce, I've said this before, Chris. Let me see how much of a Lakers fan you are. I've argued Paul Pierce had a better career and is a better franchise player than Kobe.
We'd have to go take a look at the numbers on that one.
Okay, so Chris isn't giving it to me outright. And I keep saying this about Kobe. Kobe's longevity especially with the franchise, is amazing. Kobe played, I think, 1,300 some games with the Lakers. And I've said this before about them, for as much as I bash Kobe, and I did get some Kobe bashing in today, Chris, because Sports Center pointed out how many great points per game games Kobe had. And I was like, this is a ludicrous metric, all those players with the exclusion of Kevin Durant, because they compared him to Steph Curry, LeBron James, and Michael Jordan. I was like, all of those players pass more than Kobe. There's a very simple answer. But I give Kobe a lot of credit, and I say until his last contract, he was underpaid his entire career. So I give him a lot, and his impressiveness was longevity. So that is a hard question between him versus, because Paul Pierce did not play his entire career with the Celtics. I don't know if he cracked 1,000 games with them, but anyway.
Let's emphasize that Kobe Bryant did, in fact, average 6.3 assists per 36 for his career, which is much higher than the average wing.
Yes, he was. Yeah. He was very, and it's funny.
He was a talented passer. He just didn't choose to pass as often as he could have.
And he was, and up until his last contract he was a good rebound. He's a player that we actually thought was very good, and was even above average at shooting. Ironically, we were just like, if you were more of a role player, you could have helped the Lakers out more all of that year with Karl Malone. That was his best per minute year, where he took a back seat because there was Karl Malone, Shaquille O'Neal, and Gary Payton on the squad. But then that just was not to be.
Let's do this. I'm going to try to do some quick math with Boxscore Geeks. So according to Boxscore Geeks, Kobe Bryant's average wins produced in his career was 6.2, which is pretty good, and he was an above average player in his career. So 20 years times 6.2 is going to end up with 124 wins produced.
And by the way, just to because I don't know if everybody knows this tool, and we actually do make it a little harder. If you go to the player comparison engine, if you select career at the top and click compare, you can actually throw the players in.
Oh, really? I got to do that then. Hold on. Let me get Paul Pierce, and let me bring up Paul Pierce. Slowly it loads. Oh, I've got the double screen set up. I've got my laptop and I've got an iPad.
So Paul Pierce actually does have a better career wins per 48. Career adjusted's 48, and wins produced above Kobe. 145 wins produced for Paul Pierce, 124.8 for Kobe.
Well, I think the numbers would say that Paul Pierce. Well, here would be the other thing. Yeah, I think that the numbers would say that Paul Pierce was a better franchise player. At which point, Kobe Bryant fans would say they point to their hand and say 5.
Yeah.
But of course that's Shaq and that should there you should be thanking Shaq and Pau Gasol and Lamar Odom.
I agree.
Pau Gasol going to Portland, I think he signed up with the team this year, didn't he?
And so there was the original point just was a Paul Pierce player is a Ray Allen player is what I call a player, because that was what was required to get KG to that squad, even though I'm basically saying they had better than Kobe waiting for him. And he wouldn't sign until they picked up Ray Allen. And actually, at the time, Ray Allen was coming off the worst season of his career. It wasn't known that he was going to come back and be great. So the very same thing that you're saying about Kuzma and Avery Bradley, if those players are just placating Anthony Davis and LeBron James, that's worth it because they're Anthony Davis and LeBron James.
Exactly. I'm going to look up, see if we can find. Now I'll have to figure it out later. I'll play with the tool later. An interesting point is I do think the Lakers fans love Kobe to death because of yay points and because he was just aesthetically a very pleasing player to watch. And I do think that one of the things that we have to remember is that sports is entertainment, and if people like watching a particular player, then that is a huge benefit. And I think that it's interesting, I hear this sentiment a lot, and I tend to agree with it, that while I admire the productivity of James Harden, I don't like watching him.
I've heard that, and so I've got a lot. I'll see if I can choose the things going. What I'll say is we compare basketball and all professional sports in the United States to pro
the
wrestling.
WWE.
And I'm wearing my Mick Foley shirt today, as always. So anyway, the point is, if you're a fan of professional wrestling, what gets really amusing is there are these things called heel turns and face turns. That's where someone was a hero, Hulk Hogan's the hero, then Hulk Hogan backstabs his friend. This has happened in WCW in the 1990s, infamously for the NWO. He becomes a villain, and everybody's like, oh my goodness. And if you take any professional wrestler that's been around for any lick of time and look at their career, when you're trying to fit a narrative of this is the hero that's never done anything wrong, John Cena is the Superman, good boy, all-American that never does anything wrong. There's a point in his career where he was a rapper and was smacking women on the butts in WWE. You know, it doesn't look good. You don't want to see it. But if you like go to like What Culture or Cultaholic, they'll be like, here are things that they just want you to gloss over. Sports is very much the same way. The narrative of Kobe is he is this franchise player that was always productive for the Lakers and always put it all on the line and never wanted out. If we look over history, that is not true. But the narrative in sports wins out so often. As you were saying, the media and the fans want it. So with Kobe, I think the thing is, we don't have a lot of, and this is not the player's fault, we don't have a lot of loyalty or players that stick with a franchise forever. Kobe gives us that. And because Kobe gives us that, people will overlook a lot of other stuff. And that's just narrative overwhelming.
They'll overlook rape allegations. I want to point that out.
Yeah.
He scored a lot of points. He looked good while he was doing it. He was a showman. He had a knack for hitting shots in timely moments, largely because he took so many shots. And as a result, I mean, he's worshipped by NBA players. He's worshipped by so many fans, even though, again, I think the argument would be, I think Kobe Bryant is one of the most skilled players that's ever played in the NBA, but his judgment on how to use those skills was some of the worst judgment in the history of the NBA.
Actually, Chris, I want to end that with a tweet that got some love I made today, where I said the Moneyball story in Major League Baseball is a bunch of geeky nerds, people that look like this podcast, manipulated statistics to win baseball games. That's that. And there's actually a great Brooklyn Nine-Nine episode about it, which is funny. So there's that. The NBA Moneyball story that I'll give you is that a bunch of smart NBA players exploited points per game to make a lot of money. And someone was like, is that a movie yet? And I said, not yet. But I said, if it was my movie, the pinnacle ending scene of the Yay Points movie would be Kobe Bryant's two jerseys getting hoisted into the Raptors, Abdul-Jabbar and Shaquille O'Neal. That would be my ending. So to Kobe Bryant's point, Kobe Bryant has done everything he needs to do to get paid, and we cannot for a second fault that.
Yeah. And, you know, he has accomplished amazing things in basketball. He won 5 championships, was a part of these great teams. He's already won an Oscar in the entertainment world, amazingly enough. You didn't know this?
I knew that for his basketball story.
Yeah, he's already won an Oscar. And with the sale of Body Armor, which was one of the startups that he invested in and endorsed, he made, an additional $100 million off that deal.
Dear God. So, yeah, that is I was going to say.
Not that he needed more money, but he made $100 million off that investment.
That's ludicrous. Man, the Lakers are better than the Bulls at producing successful business people, I guess. But who knows? I was going to say, I know, Chris, you said you didn't want to stay too long because as I did want to end with this to maybe yes. I have 2 things to end with, so I guess I'll let them both be shout outs. So you ruptured your ACL, which I think we mentioned at the top of the show. Achilles. Why do I confuse those all the time, Chris?
Because they're devastating injuries and they knock the person out for almost a year.
Also, Klay Thompson and Kevin Durant.
That's true.
Well, then I was going to say, what was Kobe's major injury back in the day?
Achilles tendon rupture.
Yep.
Okay. So I was just going to say, did want to shout that out. And then also say, when we talk narratives, one thing that amuses me about professional athletes that you get to, some silver lining, I guess, Chris, appreciate is how much of an impact that is on someone. I think so many people, an athlete gets injured and they're like, oh, why aren't they trying harder? Why aren't they back? You're saying that rehab process is absolutely rough.
It's tough. And the biggest problem, and again, I will come back from this because I'm not a professional athlete. I don't need to compete against world-class athletes. Like that's not what I do. I'm just glad that I didn't injure my brain. But when Kobe came back from his Achilles tendon injury, the biggest difference was he lost his explosiveness and ability to finish around the basket. He could still get past people. He still had a good enough first step to get to the rim, but he couldn't finish over people anymore. And that basically turned him into a jump shooter. And a jump shooter without the ability to drive, especially when you're busy shooting contested jump shots, is just not very efficient. The season he was injured, the season he ruptured his Achilles tendon, he actually had a comeback season. He had come back from a below average season in 2012, although of course he still scored a ton of points, and actually produced almost 10 wins in that 2012-2013 season. So one of the arguments I would say is if he had played 3 more years without that Achilles injury, after his Achilles injury, he actually lost 4.4 wins off his career total.
Oh yeah, because he had 2 negative seasons and
3 negative seasons.
3 negative seasons consecutively.
So if instead of those 3 negative seasons at minus 4.4, he had just continued to age and perhaps put up another 20 wins or so, he would have actually been ahead of Paul Pierce.
Yeah. Yep.
So the injury, which again, at the time it happened, it was pretty clear to me. It was like Achilles tendon injury. People don't come back from that. This is it. And I'm glad we got a few final moments, even though they were painful years. That final game, which is a magnificent summary of Kobe Bryant. He scores 60 points on 50 shots in a horribly inefficient way and rides out the hero.
And I look at that game and basically he was horrible going into the fourth. And it takes a beautiful mindset to go, I've taken 30 to 40 bad shots through 3 quarters. Why don't I take 20? And it was a throwaway game. I've mentioned that game before because I've looked it up. Because for those that don't remember, that was the same night that Steph Curry broke the all-time 3-point record to score over 400 threes in a season.
And the Warriors won their 73rd game.
So that was a huge night for Warriors fans, but Kobe Bryant was getting the front page on ESPN, and it was a throwaway game for the Jazz. The Jazz knew they were eliminated from the playoffs, so their starters were resting. Kobe Bryant was shooting.
Their starters still played. Let's be careful. They probably didn't play with the ferocity of a team that needed to win to make the playoffs. But their starters still played. It's not like they threw out a Mark Madsen in the starting lineup to take 10 3-pointers kind of effort.
And yeah, for those that are forgetting, that was when the Celtics were tanking intentionally for what, Tim Duncan or?
So I think in this case it was the Timberwolves that were tanking, but they literally had, instead of playing Kevin Garnett, they rested Kevin Garnett. They had Mark Madsen start at power forward, and Madsen took 10 3-pointers in the game.
That's some quality tanking.
Did want to give some appreciation to real-world injuries because I know as sports fans we often have the 10,000-foot view, the analytical person, and so we have that in person. I was just going to give this last shout-out, and this is kind of a somber one because it's actually how we're friends, Chris. So Jeremy Lin recently gave an interview where he says he's hit rock bottom because he feels the NBA doesn't want him anymore. Basically, he's entered free agency and his phone's not ringing. As the cold calculating egghead, it is easy to say his numbers have dropped. If he hadn't gotten injured on that Brooklyn contract, he's probably still playing in the NBA. But he's just been injured and not the same player for years now. But we were friends because when Linsanity happened, you wrote a fantastic blog piece about the negative stereotypes of Asian Americans in the NBA, which just, was one of the, of all the takes that were happening at the time, I was really happy that take was out there. And I reached out to you about it, and then we collaborated with Wages and Wins, et cetera. So it is a bummer to see this with Jeremy Lin. And, I just figured I'd give him a shout out to say, I'm glad he got a title. He's probably right that he's done in the NBA. And I wish he had stayed healthy in Brooklyn.
Yeah, and again, shout out to Palo Alto's own Jeremy Lin.
Yeah.
If you go to the Mitchell Park Library, they actually have Jeremy Lin Court because that is the court where he played when he was growing up after school. And I don't feel too bad for Jeremy. Obviously, it's tough for any athlete to give up their career, but obviously he's got a Harvard education, very smart guy to fall back on. And as I pointed out to my mother, he made $66 million in his NBA career, so I'm pretty sure he's not poor.
Yeah, it was a very interesting scenario there where the Rockets essentially, because they were embarrassed that they missed on him, had to shove it to the Knicks to sign him, which did benefit him greatly. And he wasn't he only made $8 million a season at a time where we thought he probably only needed 5 or 6 wins to justify that. He just couldn't stay healthy. And there are a lot of players like that where it's a real bummer where you just go, I wish you could have been healthy a couple more seasons.
And think about this, though. Sorry, Chris, just real fast. He's 30 years old. That's ancient for the NBA, right? That's a hell of a lot younger than all of us, and we're considered to be, in our prime or whatever we're supposed to be doing for business. But Jeremy Lin at 30, that's it. He doesn't have anything left.
Yeah, and again, the thing is that he will be able to go into business or do other things if he wants to. I mean, I can tell you that here So obviously Stanford is just up the road. That's my alma mater as well. Stanford produces a ton of athletes. Very famously, it's won the Directors Cup for the best overall NCAA athletics program 25 years in a row.
And that's all the sports combined is what that means.
All the sports combined. But obviously most of those athletes don't go on to play professionally. A lot of them do in football and in baseball, but for a lot of these other athletes, they don't go on, especially in basketball. There haven't been a huge number of Stanford players in the NBA, although there are ones like Dwight Powell, for example. And what many of them do is they go into business and they're very successful. So I have met many of the Stanford athletes who I remember watching when I was an undergrad or in later years, and they're now working as successful real estate brokers. They're working as successful high-tech executives and doing all these different things. So Jeremy Lin's 30 years old. He's got a Harvard degree, obviously a very smart guy. He's got the fame to open up doors. I'm pretty sure he's going to do fine for himself.
Yeah.
And I saw someone make the point, they brought up Chris Bosh, where they just said Chris Bosh was basically fighting with doctors that were saying, if you play, you could die. To be a professional athlete, you have to love this activity to such a degree that I do have all the feels in the world to say, think of the thing you've loved most. These athletes might have loved it more than you love that. And it's fleeting, and when it's gone, it's gone. So that's where
Drake,
Jeremy.
Can I bring up one thing real fast? The one I remember the most is Steve Nash. He was almost 40 years old, playing for the Lakers. He didn't want to retire. He wanted to keep playing. And he had this famous interview where he was just devastated that he had to quit. And he's like, it's not my choice to retire. I'm forced to retire. And he was emotional about it, even at 40.
Yeah. He had back spasms at the time and could barely walk.
And it was, again, the blame there goes to Damian Lillard, who broke Steve Nash's leg, not Steve Jobs. That would be funny. He broke Steve Nash's leg at the start of the season accidentally.
Yep.
Yeah, that's definitely rough. Okay, Chris, I'll let you say whatever you want to end on. We'll promote your stuff one more time, and that'll be our show. Thanks for giving us so much time.
Well, as always, you can find me online on Twitter at Chris Yeh, ChrisYeeh. You can search for Blitzscaling, that's BLITZSCALING. If you enjoy hearing these wonderful bits of wisdom about basketball or companies or what have you, you can always meet my overinflated speaking fees. Just reach out at chrisyeh.com. That's ChrisYeeh.com.
And then, of course, I apologize, Chris. I do not know what it is about my brain, but whenever I say gray, the second word is never the right one. So I want to
Greylock.
So
the Greylock Gray Matter podcast. Look for the Blitzscaling series there, and it's GREYLOCK or Gray Matter, GREYMATTER.
And I'm getting reminded because, like I said, I streamed the first one and then just forgot to hit subscribe on Downcast, and so I've got 4 episodes to catch up on. And I've mentioned this to you, Chris, on my walk, there is actually a Hoffman design firm around where I live. So I walk by signs that say Hoffman Design as I'm listening to Reid Hoffman talk about design. So that's a lot of fun. I am your host, Dre Alvarez, a.k.a. Nerd Numbers, Brian Foster, Boxscore Brian. This has been the Boxscore Geek Show. You can find us at boxscoregeeks.com. We go live every week, twitch.tv/Nerd Numbers. You can catch the recaps on channel Nerd Numbers on YouTube. And then, of course, we have the iTunes and Stitcher show, the Boxscore Geek Show. Subscribe, upvote, helps us out. Thanks so much. Thanks again, Chris. I'm sure we'll be talking more Lakers, especially if they get Giannis in a few years. And we'll see you next time.